Jeff, my man. So we were just talking about like shooting coyotes with a high accuracy, or I should say high tech scopes. Dude, we
hmm
got to get together one day and just plunk away at something, right? Just take the guns out, just plunk away. And by mentioning that very thing, I'm guaranteed to at least get 800 haters coming out of the woodwork.
Because you shoot coyotes.
That, yeah,
Mhm.
mainly that. Yep. So, and some people just don't like other people owning firearms. I've come to understand that more keenly as I get older.
Yeah, that's true. It's really lots of differing ideas throughout the country. I remember years ago I was reading, I think it was Building the Kingdom of God. Um, oh, who was the gentleman in the church who wrote that? You can help me out here. He was the one of the church historians, and it was about the United Order efforts in the
Was
church.
that was that Arrington?
Yep, that's
Okay.
exactly who it was. And
Okay.
maybe Building the City of God. Um, anyway, see how much I remember. It's been 20 years, but in it, I found a lot of interesting things. But there was one part where there was a list, when the Saints got to Utah, the part of their problem in staying alive was the predators.
Hmm.
And there was this list there was a reprint and a copy of a flyer that had been put out where Brigham had decided to put a bounty out to help the, the saints
Hmm.
control the predators, because every attempt they had to have chickens or any kind of livestock
Sure.
was so inhibited by um, everything from grizzly bears, down to weasels. And so he had a list and a price tag, a bounty that he was willing personally to pay for each one of these predators. And it started with grizzly bear and went down to black bear and it went down the list. It went to all of the hawks, the eagles, the bald eagles, the gold eagles, the owls. If you brought him a predator, he'd pay you. And, he was wealthy, and he figured this was a way to help the people be able to survive in an area that was very hostile. And, but I read through that just chuckling to myself at how many people would just absolutely lose it over the head of the church coming out with a hit list on anything that was dangerous to surviving in a harsh environment. And
Dude, we are entirely too soft today, right? Like
uh,
excuse me, as a society at large, we are way too soft. Like, and what's interesting is that most of the people that raise a stink aren't the ones out there in nature, right? I mean, most of the people who raise a stink about harvesting your own game, those sorts of things, they have this weird idea that like things in the forest die of old age, right? Like an elk just gets to be a certain age and he just lays under a tree and peacefully slips away to the other side. And I'm like, you have not spent enough time in the forest because in the wild, very, very, very few things die of natural causes, right? If an elk gets old, a deer gets old, they're just food for the predator, right? I mean, that's all there is to it. There is no peaceful slipping away. I'm sure you can find some examples of that, but by and large, man, once you get old and feeble, out in the forest, you are done. And um I remember the first time I hunted. My dad was like, "Okay, you show some respect and reverence for the animal. You took a life." And I remember it was hard, right? Even as a young man who wasn't overly sensitive or anything else, I remember thinking, well, this kind of feels crappy, right? And I remember my dad saying, that's a good feeling. You don't ever want to lose that feeling. You should be proud that you're putting food on the table, but at the same time, you need to understand that everything comes with a cost. And that feeling that you have is a good marker of your humanity. And most hunters I know are not bloodthirsty guys looking for a kill. They're just, putting food on the table. But it's such a large disconnect now, Jeff, because You need meat, you go to the store, right? I mean, that's
Yep.
really unusual in human existence, right? The last 50, 100 years, it's been an aberration in human history. This idea of you just go to the store and buy meat and produce and whatever you need and take it back home. Before that, we were part of that ecosystem, and now it seems like we have divorced ourselves from that. And by doing so, it's given people this false idea that it's always going to be around. And this kind of ties into what we're going to talk about tonight, right? I mean, nobody is thinking about what you do when things get tough, right? And we know as Mormons, we should all be very keen on some things Joseph had said and Brigham had said about how bad it's going to be. And I feel like people aren't giving enough time to develop strategy on how to survive those things. And so when you told me about your idea, I was instantly intrigued. And so that's what we're going to focus on here. Jeff's working on a project that I think may have some solutions there. So Jeff, again, dude, it's always fun to talk. I appreciate you coming on to talk about it.
No worries. Biggest problem with you and I, Dave, is we'll get sidetracked and talking about other things. So
That's
you'll have
okay.
to you'll
That's
have to
okay.
keep
This
it on track, you know?
it's a very niche, um, a very niche set of people that I think can stand listening to me because we'll start out talking about something and then we'll go off on some tangents, but we always seem to make our way back. It's like this is what happens when you cross somebody riddled with ADD who's a Mormon fundamentalist. You
But
get
that's you.
that would be me. Yes. Yes, absolutely. So,
Uh,
dude, tell me about your idea here.
well, you know, oh boy, how do you encapsulate it in just an idea? We talked a little bit about some of these things, what, a month and a half, 2 months ago,
Sure.
and we talked about, how to be prepared for what's coming. And if you go and start reading some of the old, the Journal of Discourses, some of the stuff that our parent, the journals, and even journals of your ancestors, if you're Mormon and you have that kind of heritage, they had to carve out a living and survive, relying upon their own efforts
Hmm.
and that of their neighbors. Hopefully you wished you had neighbors,
Right.
because it's hard to do by yourself.
Yep.
It's very difficult. And even those individuals who have tried to homestead in our modern world, you find it takes years and years to even feel like you've made a dent. It's
Hmm.
very, very difficult to unplug. And probably 1991, my first wife and I, we moved to Montana. We eventually had 10 acres that we moved on to that was 5 miles out of town up a serious four-wheel drive road. And by serious four-wheel drive, I mean chain up all fours 3 months out of the year, at least maybe four, just to
Right.
get home. And it was quite the experience. It was amazing. And I had hunted a little bit as a kid, not much. My dad took me out deer hunting a couple times. But to move into that environment I was 27 when we moved there, and we had 4 kids, and we moved into a teepee.
Nice.
Years later, lived for the summer. I thought I could build a cabin in 3 months, because yeah. But it was one of the greatest experiences. We ended up living there for from 93 ish, on the mountain till '01, and ended up building a off-grid 3-story straw bale house. No power, no electricity. Went off grid, and I was determined to try to learn some of these skills because my parents had raised me that in a lot of the traditional Mormon ways, that you're self-sufficient, and I'd always wanted to have a cabin in the woods. And my kids were young, and we just had a great time. We homeschooled. We had food storage in the house. There was wood all around. We had heat. We had a creek that flowed 100 yards from the house that we got all of our drinking water out of. I mean, it was paradise. And but you learn some harsh lessons, and you learn that one mistake, one miscalculation or even if I'd have gotten injured and not
Right.
been able to get firewood, and if I didn't have enough put up, well, now the family could literally freeze to death, and you may not be able to get off the mountain to find somebody.
Right. Right.
And so I think that it was a wonderful, powerful experience. And I could probably we could spend the whole 2 hours just talking about the beauty of unplugging. But it was during that time that I started reading and digging into some other works and on self-sufficient living. I realized that in Montana, where we were at, we lived at 6,000 feet elevation, and our growing season was 30 days.
Yep.
And that played out almost every year. We had a freeze almost every month.
Yep.
And so there was no way to grow a garden. So, I had to focus my time on raising some animals, which of course brought in the bears. I ended up having to shoot a bear once. And it wasn't just interested in, the rabbits across the way that I was raising. It was interested in my dogs and their dog food. And then it was interested in the house.
Yeah.
So you realize it's just not a stretch, and you better be prepared. And so we had all these experiences, and my kids were young, and it was my wife was amazing. Oh my gosh, she would. One time the neighbors called her while I was out getting logs, and and the neighbor the neighbor lady was home alone. Her husband was off working as well in the woods, and a black bear come up and was trying to get in their house. And she ran out the back door and came down, and her boy and my boy were playing in their little bus, and she came down to about a half mile to our house and was just beside herself.
Oh
There's a
yeah.
bear. And my wife didn't know what to do, and she's a city girl from Milwaukee, but man, was she a trooper. She strapped on my SKS, and she put on a couple of bandoleros of, had all these ammo sticking out. And she'd been making bread in our cook stove, in a little camp cook stove. And so she didn't want the bear to come down and get the bread. So she was tying the bread in loaves to her belt, and she went walking up there to try to try to kill that bear and to get our son. And I thought, now there's a woman,
I'm gonna say you fell in love all over again in that moment, right?
there's a woman.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's right.
And I came home to that story, and I've told it many, many times over. And the kids grew up with those types of experiences, things that most
Hmm.
kids have no clue. And yet
Right.
people, if you subject yourself to that lifestyle, it will present opportunities like that to make you a stronger, better, more independent person, able to think in a crisis, able to respond. And anyway, it was quite the experience. So
Let me ask you something real quick before we move on.
yeah.
What were just a couple of the big lessons you took from that? Because it sounds like that was kind of your first foray into
Mhm.
kind of going off grid, right?
Yeah.
What were a couple of the big takeaways after that? It sounds like about 8 years up there on the mountain.
93. It was about an 8 year period of time, and weirdly enough, we had no bills. So the beauty of the lifestyle, some of the things I look back on it as one of the most peaceful and stress free times of my life. I mean, there was a different kind of stress to survive, but I was not stressed about the mortgage because the land was so cheap back then. We got those 10 acres for $6,000 for 10 acres
Wow.
with a creek flowing through it, and all this kind
Holy
of stuff.
cow.
Yeah. And we had um so there wasn't a mortgage, and I built the house over a period of several years, and we moved into it as soon as it was enclosed. And I started building furniture in my basement, rustic furniture, but I didn't have any bills. We didn't have electricity, so no power bill. We didn't have telephone, no telephone bill. We got water out of the creek, no water bill. Everything that we got, we relied upon the Lord and the earth and the things around us. There was plenty of dead standing. So we really only needed maybe to survive 400 or 500 a month.
Wow.
And so I look back on, the records that I kept during that time, because I unplugged, was just my tithing records. And so I had my bishop came up to me one time and he just couldn't believe. He said, Jeff, you've only put down here that you only paid $600 last year in tithing. I said, that's about right. He says, well, I declared you as a partial tithe payer because that can't be right. And I said, no, that's about right. I think I made about 6,000 last year. I had a family, but by that time we had like 6 kids, and
Right.
living, and it was just the disc. I'm not trying to make it was just you don't understand what you can do until you experience something like that. And I made enough, once if things would get tight, Cynthia'd say to me, if things are getting tight, we got $5 or something, but we had food, we had water, we had shelter, we had warmth, we had each other, we homeschooled. I mean, it was not a big deal. The worst thing that would happen is we either had to walk into church if we didn't have gas in the truck, or we went without fresh veggies for a week or two till I sold a piece of furniture. And so
Right.
if I sold one queen size bed for $500, it paid a month's worth of my bills.
Wow. And like when
Right.
you had to walk to church, how far was that?
Well, we never did have to because we always looked ahead and made sure we had enough
Okay.
gas in the truck to go to work. But that was what would have gone had we not had cash. And it puts you in a place where we had some really, really amazing experiences. I mean, the way the Lord works is, to teach you the things you want to know is He gives you an experience that kind of teaches you those things.
Right.
And if you're asking for it, if you're asking for revelation and understanding, the Lord will ask you to do something once you go along that path enough to where you trust what you're hearing. When you pray and you write down or whatever you do, that if you hear the voice of the Spirit tell you to do something and then you do it, then there's usually a lesson. Either you'll witness something or you'll experience something, or it will put you in a place where you then have to ask again, what do I do here? And there was one time where we were, the wife came and said, yeah, it's getting a little tight. I think we got $5, Jeff. And we didn't ever sweat it terribly
Hmm.
because the lifestyle allowed for that slush.
Sure.
We had 2 years worth of food in the basement and the ability to survive for a long time. So it just meant we went without cash for a period of time. And anyway, and I said, well, I'd been really, really working hard on trying to understand the voice of the Spirit, learn how to listen to the Holy Ghost versus myself versus other influences. And so I said, I'll go out and I'll pray about it. I'll ask. And it was one of those things where I was like, okay, this will be interesting, So I went outside and found the spot where I like to kind of be alone. And took my journal, because if you write things down, the Lord's more apt to kind of give you something if
Sure.
you come prepared to write it down. It's just a principle. So writing, praying and having a journal close by is something that has really been beneficial to me in the past, of showing the Lord that I'm serious and I would like to listen and hear and write what you tell me.
Sure.
So anyway, I was in the middle of that process and I asked, Father, we got $5, and you know, what do you want? Where should I go for work? Is really the question that I asked. Where should I go? Where should I go to find somebody to buy another bed or work for a week for somebody, whatever. And I the prompting that I felt and that I wrote down was,
Hmm.
go do nothing, it will come to you. And I almost chuckled because it was not something that would be something I would say. I'm more of a
Right.
proactive, I got to go out and find some work today to provide for my family. So I chuckled and I wrote down, do nothing, it will come to you. And I chuckled and, thank you, Lord. And okay. So I went back in and I walked in, and my wife knew that I'd been out praying about it. And she's like, well, I'm like, Lord said, do nothing, it'll come to us. And I just went downstairs, started working on the house or whatever I was doing. And to me, it was almost humorous because I had a chance now to listen, and to
Hmm.
see what would come up. Well, we had just barely had a phone line. We'd been up on the mountain for several years at this point, and had gone for probably 4 years without phone. And then the world decided that we needed a phone, and so they put a line up our gulch to two people. Probably
Okay.
cost 50 grand to run a line for two for two families. And anyway, and we'd had a phone for maybe a week, and all of a sudden the phone rang, and I picked it up, and the lady said, "Is this the guy that built that straw bale house?" And I said, "Yeah, yeah, yes, it is. How'd you get my phone number?" "Well, somebody here over in Anaconda, 30 miles away, said, oh, here's this guy's number that has a straw bale house." And she said, I'm building a dude ranch over here that's going to be called the 1880s Ranch in Anaconda, and I'm trying to find examples of period historic building. And I understand straw bale houses started in about the 1880s. Is that correct?" And I said, "Yeah, they started as soon as they had baling machines. They started making houses out of it." She said, "Can I come over and see it? I really want to see your house." And I said, "That'd be great. Love to have you come over and see my house." So we made an arrangement, and it was so weird enough at the moment that I was going, "There's something weird here,"
Right.
because I hadn't given her. We barely had a phone for a week.
Right.
And, yeah. And so anyway, she showed up with her manager a few days later, and she was just enthralled and walked around. And it was a 3-story straw bale house. It was this 3,000 square foot monstrosity that was half done. And, a bunch of kids running around, homeschooled little kids and stuff. And after about 10 minutes of her interviewing the kids and looking around, she's like, "You homeschool your kids?" And we're like, "Yeah." And she says, "Wow, you wouldn't even know." Kind of like she was expecting these little kids in the corner gnawing on a piece of or something. But anyway, and she was just delightful, and we chatted. And after a while, she says, "I can't use houses like this because you can't even hardly tell it's not a modern home. Once you get it
Right.
stuck, there's no way to tell." But she stayed, and she asked, and she wanted to know. And then at some point she said, "What do you do here? How do you make a living?" I said, "I make furniture." "You make furniture? Oh my goodness. I need like 8 or 10 cabins worth of furniture. Show me some pictures." So I went and got my little portfolio and showed her some of the pictures of the beds and the benches and the things that I made in my basement. And she said, I'll order, come over to my ranch tomorrow. I've got several pieces that I need to order right now, and just come on over.
Okay.
And in the process of our conversation, she asked what my religion was. And I told her. I said, "I'm Mormon." And at the time, I was in the mainstream. I was
Right.
the anomaly in the branch. I was the crazy guy that lived up on the mountain. But anyway, I was,
Right.
and and she said, "I wondered about that." And she started asking me questions, and she left with the Book of Mormon, of course.
Of
And
course. Yeah.
and she walked out the door. She went to shut the door, and she stopped it, and she said, "Can I can I tell you something that's kind of weird?" And I said, "I doubt it's weird. Go ahead and tell me." And she said, "I don't know how I got your phone number." She said, "The guy I was supposed to call lives about 45 miles away from here. And I don't know how I called your number."
Whoa.
I said, "You know what? It's not strange at all, but I'm glad you called. However it happened, whoever connected that line, I'm glad you came." I went over. She gave me 6, 8 months worth of work, you know. So the Lord,
Wow.
do nothing, it will come to you. If I'd have been off the mountain, if I'd have been off running around, if we'd have missed that one phone call, that was a miracle in and of itself. I didn't give her the number. Nobody gave her my number. It just called my house.
Whoa. Woo.
Pretty wild. So, when you put yourself out there in situations like that where you need, because our society is really good at taking care of our needs,
Yeah.
right? Everything we could ever want. So why ask the Lord to give us anything? Why
Right.
ask for his help? Why ask for his sustenance? Why, if all you got to do is dial 911 an emergency, how often do we even need to ask the Lord for help in serious matters, really?
Right.
And there's always somebody there. And so one of my biggest takeaways was that part of the reason why the Lord asks us to live more simple and what I would call the old paths. I'll explain that in a minute. But a part of why he's always encouraged his people to live outside of what would be considered, uh, you know, um, a fancy city. There's
Right.
very few scriptures out there where the Lord has ever encouraged his people to go move into a city.
Right.
It's rare. Um, there will be instances, obviously, a city of Zion or such, where, but even that was designed as an agrarian pursuit.
Right.
Even the way Joseph lined that out
Yeah.
was
Yep.
self-sufficient, enough acreage in town to grow a big garden and acreage out of town to raise your own food.
No,
And so,
that's
yeah,
exactly right. I saw, being a surveyor, I'm always down for looking at old maps, right? Like,
right, right,
to me, that's the
exactly.
perfect decor to a house. The girls don't think so, but I think old maps is the way to go. Um,
Yeah,
so so subsequently, when I have an office, a home office, the maps go in there. But so looking at the old plat of Zion, and what they were, what Joseph had received was, it was kind of a mix of the two, right? Because all the agricultural stuff would be on kind of the exterior of the bit massive city block, and then on the inside would be your homes and that sort of thing. And so
mm-hmm.
it was kind of the best of both worlds, but was still based in an agrarian kind of lifestyle.
Right.
And so you would just go out to the fields on the outskirts of town to work and then
Yep.
come back home. And so it was kind of the best of both worlds. It was scalable. It was
Right.
designed to handle about 10 to 15,000 people, and then you'd
Yep.
start another stake,
Right.
and you would do it all over again.
Mm-hmm. So there's a real interesting book out there called "Surviving Off Grid," and it's written by a guy who self admits that he's an underground Baptist minister. Basically, he's an old Anabaptist. He's basically Amish, but not Amish.
Right,
He's one of plain folk. There's several subdivisions, and I don't understand it. But his book is unbelievably amazing about the Lord to his people through the Bible, basically. That he desires for us to live simply. He desires for us to live off the land. He desires for us to have an understanding of the ecology and to be good stewards and to raise our own food for all of these reasons. And whenever there has been societies that have crumbled, such as Rome and such as we're about ready to go through, it's because we are not connected to our food source typically. And so that very huge, humans, it takes about 3 days before there's total anarchy. And you get a big city back then and a big city today. And if you cut off their food supply for whatever reason, a natural disaster, look what's happened down, and the
right,
terrible and the looting that's going on, even in North Carolina and in Florida. And, you know, if these, if our society was more what Joseph saw was more agrarian to begin with, then every person would have the opportunity to be as self sufficient as they can, adding to the whole of a community and the ability of the community to be a healthy cell of humanity, so to speak, a stake in Zion, if you will, that take care of themselves and then their own. Um, I don't know what the numbers are that, how many people you have to take care of the rest of the people. I don't know if that even makes sense, but, we're plunging headlong from a capitalist society into socialist communism right now, right?
right.
And at what point do the people who are willing to work, can they not take care of a percentage of people who aren't willing to work? There's a certain ratio that I'm sure is eternal, right? Where the people, as the Lord would say, those who are, the laborer, you know, the person who doesn't labor shouldn't eat the bread of the laborer, kind of thing. That there's a balance of do your best, take care of each other, and when that gets out of balance, then the society is bound and headed down the road of collapse, and it's usually never not a pretty collapse.
No, and we read books like Atlas Shrugged, those sorts of things. There does
Mm-hmm.
come a point where the guys that do things just get sick of doing things for free, right? They get sick of doing it for and oftentimes not just doing it for free, but getting beat up while doing it, right?
Mhm.
And that they
Right.
just quit doing it. And that's a possibility. Total, look, we've we right now are a society that has printed more money in the world ever, right? I
Mhm.
mean, we
Right.
absolutely, if printing money was an Olympic sport, we would just continue to gold medal over and over and over. And it doesn't take a genius to see that that's kind of not kind of very unsustainable. It's going to come back to bite you in the butt. And
Right.
there's a host of things that could do this. Back to what you were saying about most families being 3 days away from starvation. That's 100% true. I
Mhm.
I had a good friend for years who was an emergency management coordinator, and he told me that very same thing. He said, and he was referring to New Orleans during Katrina. And he said,
Mhm.
and I'll never forget this. He said it took exactly 3 days for the veil of civilization to be ripped off entirely. He said it was back to roving gangs. It was absolutely nasty. Um, we're just not equipped anymore. And
Mhm.
you were talking about growing your own food, and I think this is something that's a bigger problem even than just um, being disconnected from our food sources. We live in a society today where there's not much that's real anymore, right?
Mhm.
Um, you see everyone's got their nose buried in their phone. And look, I'm partially, I find myself getting sucked down those rabbit holes once in a while. I'm a guy who does a podcast, right? I like technology. Having said that, though, you spend too much time in it, it's not real, right? And I think we're in a place now in society that we have essentially built built everything on things that aren't real, right? Your friends on Facebook, unless you actually know them and spend time on the phone talking to them, friend is only a title, right? It's not what you think it is. Those aren't real friends. Um,
Yep.
you got guys, kids, and when I say kids, I mean guys in their 20s who live inside their computer, right? They play video games constantly. Um, again, it's not real. We've detached from anything that's real. And in some weird way, I was thinking about this a few weeks back. We've built a Tower of Babel, kind of a digital Tower of Babel, right? Everything is done digitally, the transfer of money. It's not really cash anymore, it's just credits. We really have detached from anything that's real. And that's going to come back to haunt us.
I think you're very accurate in that, and that's kind of the message of that book I was telling you about. He goes into the history of it, and it's more of a book of philosophy, not how to. There's
Right.
tons of how to homestead books, but his book was philosophical and religious in nature. And his whole thing was that if we don't learn how, that our civilization is headed down the road of destruction. And we all, if we have a religious bent to us, we believe that.
Mm-hmm.
um, so his idea and his thoughts were that um, that if we don't learn to live not just off grid, because even the technology of off grid is technology.
Right.
He calls it surviving off grid. So start by going off grid and then go off grid, and live like
Right.
your ancestors, live like your great grandparents used to live. And then you might have a chance of surviving what's coming. And so as I experienced that time in Montana with my kids and my wife, and I'm sorry, I'm looking down here because I'm trying to send you a picture of that house so you can understand
No,
what
you're
I went.
good.
I'm going to send this over real quick while I talk. But anyway, I learned that one, I didn't need everything that I thought I needed. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
uh, that I could live on way less. That the Lord was willing to help me, and that I could be in way more um, opportunities to learn by the Spirit and by following the Lord. It required me to petition the Lord routinely for my
Mm-hmm.
very survival, for my very survival. And yet, in the process of that, I was freer and more at peace than I had ever been in my whole life. I wasn't worried about 3 days from now because I had plenty of food. I wasn't
Right.
worried what was going on outside in the world because it didn't affect me in any way unless they
Right.
came up to my door, and then I had things for that, at least hopefully.
Right.
It was one of the most amazing experiences of freedom that I've it was the most free I have ever felt. Um, Knowing that I could take care of myself and my family for the most part, you know, despite even the intrusions of the powers that be for once a year pay us taxes or we'll take your land, you know, those kind of things still weighed upon me. But it was only one thing instead of 10 things.
Right.
And my kids and I learned, you know, I learned with my children and with my wife how to, you know, how to be okay, how to sit around and enjoy each other's company, because that's what was fun,
Right.
what we wanted. If we felt impressed to jump in the car for 2 weeks and roll, we could, because we had no ties. I wasn't worried about the kids' schooling because we take it with us. You know, I'd
Right.
throw. I was an old window clean. I had a window cleaning business when we moved there, so I'd throw my window cleaning bucket and all my squeegees and a ladder on top of the Suburban, and we'd just roll and go visit family for 2 weeks. And when I needed to come home, I'd go wash windows for 2 days and get enough gas money and drive home.
Wow.
It was it was amazing. I would do it again. Um, you know, I look back on those days with great fondness. I know a lot of all my kids look back at them, those that can remember it, that weren't so young when we finally left, you know. But it was a it was an experience. So that was the biggest takeaway was one, I learned how to trust in the Spirit of the Lord. You know, I learned how to listen because that was where everything came from. That was where my survivability came from. And I think we need to learn that. We've replaced the Lord and our dependence upon him with everything that the world provides.
Mm-hmm.
Our grocery stores, to our social events, to, you know, even if things go bad, you know, the government will take care of you. They just got you till you're dead, you
Right.
know? So we don't turn to the Lord like we should. And I think he wished that we would live a different lifestyle. He wished that we would stay. I think that's kind of reminiscent of Isaiah and his, you know, his cry to come out of her, oh ye my people, that you be not partakers of her plagues. Well, the plagues are just, I mean, there's tons of them, but they are the opposite side of what God wants us to learn. And so we end up eating food that we don't know where it comes from. It's really wonderful and it tastes good, but we end up becoming a people that are indulgent upon our senses instead of, you know, the
Right.
opposite. And so there's so many different things. So I think the Lord would have us, if we would, to return to the what he calls the old ways. There's an interesting scripture in Jeremiah, and I have to give credit to the guy who wrote that book again, because he quoted it in for the first time I looked it up and went, that's amazing. But in Jeremiah chapter 6, verse 16, basically the people are told by the Lord, seek out and find for the old paths wherein lies the good way. And
Okay.
therein you'll find, I'm butchering it, and therein you will find peace. And the people said, we will not.
Right.
They just flat out said, see you later, you know. And that was about, you know what, that was Jeremiah, so a few years before they were destroyed by Babylon. Carried
Right.
off, butchered, killed, you know, because they were all conveniently stuck in one little city area, easy to conquer, and all they had to do was sit there and not feed them for 3 days and they ate themselves. Yeah, I don't know, but that's how most of the cities go down,
Right.
is they just hungry and eat themselves.
Yep. Absolutely. So let's talk about the idea, the plan here you got, because I think that, I think we've done a good job of just encapsulating what we're kind of up against as a society. And
Yep.
let's talk about a solution you've come up with.
Yeah. Well, it's ideas that have come from, you know, 30 years of me experimenting with my family. And I've tried to do it by myself, and it's very, very difficult. You know, it takes years and years to accomplish. And there's a lot of folks who can't, who are their job won't let them move to the country.
Right.
There's just a lot of folks who are stuck. And so I've thought about this for an awful long time, of how communities and family groups and individuals can, you know, get out of the city environment and start learning how to be self-sufficient. And I don't think it can be done very easily as an individual. It's hard to escape. Our society has created a trap, this modern society trap. And we spend so much money, and we have to even to buy the land. It's almost so expensive anywhere in the United States to even purchase land. You can't get 10 acres for $6,000 anymore. There's just nowhere that you could do that, especially with water. But so my thoughts have centered around more united order type efforts, people working together, family groups, and how could they accomplish, um, finding a piece of ground that would work with a group of people who enjoy each other's company. Usually that falls into a religious group or a family group, people who care about each other enough. But it doesn't have to be that way. I think that individuals who believe certain principles, I think if a group of people that wanted to gather together with other people who believed in freedom and property rights and self-sufficient living and agrarianism and wanted to try, I think that they could make a good go of it, you know.
Hmm.
Um, but anyway, it would start with finding parcels of ground that would hold 5 or 6 or 10 families or 100 families or more, and finding that land, subdividing it. And I think there's two or three classes of individuals that could help each other, which is kind of the core idea of coming together as people, is that you might have some richer folks who have worked and had jobs that have given them, but they're stuck in the city because that's where the jobs are. And then you might
Right.
have individuals who are more willing to help, but they might not have a nickel to their name, you know, but they might have strength and the willingness to be of service and to go and build something if they only knew how. And so I've kind of tried to put some of these ideas together over the years. And one of my thoughts are, as I've met a lot of people who would love to get out of the city and probably have the money to do so, but don't know how to get out. They just don't know. And I think if they thought that they could buy a parcel of ground in a subdivision that was dedicated to these types of ideas, and that if someone in that community would basically create and help build a turnkey homestead in their absence, that they could visit, that they could come to, that they could help, but they wouldn't have to leave until they were ready to leave because their source of income's in the city. And maybe that would be, there's a lot of philosophy out there that, when things get really bad, I'll get out. And I hope, but how many people who want to do that would actually be able to time that? And then what could they do? Could they find a place? They certainly aren't going to find a place where the goats are milking or the greenhouse
No,
has lettuce growing, you know.
no.
But what if you had, my thoughts are, what if we could take and start gathering lists of people who were interested in, say, an internship, um, people who would love to work their way to a parcel, you know, over a year or two or whatever was appropriate based on amount of time given and so on and so forth, where they could come in and learn how to take care of animals and grow gardens and build greenhouses and build barns and sheds and all the things that come with living self-sufficiently, at the same time in an internship setting where maybe their room and board are taken care of and they're even maybe paid some. I haven't figured out all the things. I'm just thinking about it philosophically. A group of people who are dedicated to getting a parcel and building a homestead. And once they have it, well, now they have to make a living. And then what if you had a section of ground and 2 or 3 or 4 individuals like that who had proven themselves, and now they wanted a living taking care of somebody else's place, hiring
Okay.
themselves out. And so then people who aren't ready to quite yet move could buy a parcel and hire somebody in the community to make sure that their greenhouse is going year round, make sure that their animals, if they want to raise goats or sheep, or if they want to, whatever they decide to do for their parcel, there are people there that they could hire, and their homestead would be perpetual. And the food from it and the resources from it could either be taken back or could be taken to the city or could be sold at the market, and then the money could be given to them to take care of their more, whatever their needs are. There's a lot of different ways that it could be run, but the classes of people would be working together toward the same goal, that a community of self-sufficient people would live together there who understand what that means. um, I know that in its idea state where it's at right now, there's a tremendous amount of the more particular matters that will need to be dealt with as I play with the idea and people gather and we throw around the logistical ideas and say, how are we going to make this work? But I think that there's an opportunity. And you and I talked a little bit, the last time about, helping the remnant in whatever far-reaching idea you may put upon that remnant, whether it be the absolute descendants of Lehi or the remnant of Jacob and all of its facets and all those different things. But somehow we need to find a way to live self-sufficient and survive through what's coming. And I don't think
Right.
it's going to be, I don't think it's going to be easy.
Right.
We have to find a way to help our neighbor. Um, Interestingly enough, Thomas Jefferson, when he ran for president a few years before Joseph Smith was born, I think he ran in '02, or he became the president in 1802 or 1804. Joseph Smith was born in 1805. So these were some of the ideas that Joseph Smith was kind of raised with. But he ran on this idea of an agrarian society. And it was
Mm-hmm.
his
Yep.
and his desire and his understanding that he did not want, and neither did the founding fathers want, for the tragedies of what had happened in Europe, which
Right.
the industrial revolution, they felt it was destroying Europe.
Right.
And they did not want that to happen here. And so his idea was that if we could populate the country, the entire North America, with agrarian society, that it could never be destroyed from without, because
Right.
each community would be healthy and self-sufficient. And you could take a community and it wouldn't affect, the rest of the country.
Right.
And there's just some deep truths to those things. And I think that he was right on track with his ideas. Of course, we've messed that up.
Sure. Sure. Well,
But
more than you know, Jeff. So look,
mm,
now that you're starting to play with land here a little bit, you know how
mm,
land is laid out west of the 13 original colonies, right? It's laid out in mile squares that,
mm-hmm,
form a township. That
right,
was Jefferson's idea. That was who came up with that. And the
right.
reason he came up with that was for two reasons. The first reason, and probably the less important reason, was it was easy to sell those parcels, right? Because you could just say, the north half of section 2 township, or 3 north range 4 west, right? Real
Mm-hmm,
easy. But more importantly, he designed every one of those townships which were 6 miles square, and 6 miles east west, 6 miles north south, 6 miles square. Those would be their own voting districts. And he did that because he's like, okay, now they can't gerrymander. And then we screwed it up. Um, but like he was not a dope. Like everybody says, oh well, they couldn't have seen what was coming, and I'm like, well, actually, if you read the notes, they're
mm-hmm.
relatively well informed on the condition of mankind's the state of the natural man. Let me
Yeah,
ask you a couple questions here, real quick first, and then because I think this will draw out some deeper conversation here and some more ideas. So when in your idea of forming this little gosh, for lack of a better word, colony, right?
mhm,
Subdivision of
yeah,
like-minded people. This
right.
isn't necessarily building Zion, right? I mean, this would be kind of a forerunner to that, you're thinking,
I
or
would assume, at this point, my thoughts are that the temporal needs of individuals from all walks of life have we've got to find a way to survive and to be safe in communities.
Right.
You know, um, what the specifics of building a Zion. Zion. How do we define Zion once again? Where the pure in heart are, where the Lord's Spirit is. All of those
Right.
kinds of things. And you could say that if a people were fleeing to Zion, as the scriptures say, some of the more prominent ones talk about that he who will not take up his sword against his neighbor must needs flee to Zion.
Right.
So, one, it will be societies and groups of individuals who just don't want to fight. They don't want to take up the sword in anger. And boy, you don't have to look very far on the news any given day to see the division that is upon our country,
Right.
and that will end in bloodshed at some point.
Okay.
There's no way to go back, in my opinion, from the ideological division that has taken place, the sheer hatred that we see politically and in so many other realms. But so in the beginning, I think that even just making it available for people to find a place to practice the peaceful way of life, as the Lord said, look to the old paths and do what I
Right.
told you a long time ago. Will maybe put you, can we even think about religious and moral ideas if we're worried where our next meal's coming from?
Right.
Well, no, we can't. If you read the Journal of Discourses, a fair share of it is on the temporal nature of them trying to survive the first number of years in the valley,
Right.
and how to get the people to be able to just go out and farm. A lot of them are very technical how to talks to make sure the people survived. And then if you can help a people learn how to survive together, then you can start dealing with the spiritual aspects
Okay.
of faith and belief. But once again, those are the things, like I was talking about my experience of trying to survive before. um I learned a lot of those things because of the hardship of surviving, relying upon God
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
not man. Yeah,
Okay.
and I'm, as I consider to be a wacko. So to start with this idea of people who are willing to try to work together and learn how to help and to raise their own food and help their neighbor and to share and all those things, it's going to take an interesting class of people that are willing to go there. And I think there are probably members of that group of people represented in all sorts of different demographics and social structures.
Right.
And the scriptures even talk about how all nations, once again, a remnant from all nations will flow to where there's peace. And I'm not so brazen or bold as to think that I could create a place that would be that place, but I can certainly do my best to try to create a place where my children and my family and some others might be able to be in a place like that, if that makes
Right.
sense.
Yeah.
And I've talked with a couple of people, and I don't even know how this would be, how this would be administered. But I was chatting with a friend of mine who was a missionary when I lived up on the mountain, and he came home and he studied for years and is getting his degree and is very well. He's written books on the Constitution and other things. And I called him a few months ago and I said, how would we go about writing up a homeowners? I hate a homeowners associations, because to me they generally they
I that's good because I can't imagine you being a Karen going out there and measuring the deciduous tree and being like
well,
you're in
no,
violation.
oh my gosh. Anyway, so I've never lived in a homeowners association, and I've heard so many horror stories, and I've worked for companies that have, dealt, do their business fixing what the homeowners associations require people to fix. And
Right.
but anyway, I thought, how would it be if we were able to actually do the opposite of a homeowners association as a homeowners association? In other words,
Right.
adopt the bylaws that are very, very similar to the Constitution. You know,
Right.
guaranteeing that you won't step on your neighbor's rights, guaranteeing that you will give them the ability to have their freedoms as you want yours. And if you wrote up a document like that, then maybe that's one way of preserving those ideas through the destruction of the Constitution and the country as we see it, but it may be held and practiced by individuals in communities because they've contracted with each other to be at peace.
Sure, sure, sure.
So I don't know. These are all things that are floating off my brain as
Well,
possibilities.
we'll get to that part because I might actually have a couple of ideas for you since
Sweet.
I survey, right? I understand the
Yeah,
subdivision process, which is essentially
yeah,
what you're looking at.
that is what
Um,
I'm.
but
Yeah.
but let's first concentrate here. You, how much land do you think, as you envision this, how
Mm-hmm.
big of a parcel of land do you think you need in order to do these subdivisions? And then how
I
many?
don't have I don't have a clue. Um, I think what I've done, and I'll just tell you over the last few years, but in particular, I've finished my work, or at least in creating. I've created an LLC for the purpose of land development, so that I could do this, and do it legally and be able to gather funds and buy properties and develop them into these subdivisions. And I've thought, there's just so many different types of people, and it would be nice to be able to buy even a nice 20-acre parcel and subdivide it into fives. I think that a family that's, I think you can survive on a good piece of ground, on an acre. If
Okay,
I think you can with the technology that we have for greenhouse and so on and so forth. And that's kind of why, I named this corporation Old Paths New, because we certainly live in what we hope to be a new and progressive world, but at the same time not deviating from the Lord's direction of the old paths and what that is to raise your own food. But we do have technology for greenhouses. We do have technology to raise fodder in a shed for your animals that's the size of a bedroom, that'll take care of all the animals you would need for meat and for dairy.
right.
And so there are things that we have, but um, I think that to be able to facilitate helping different types of groups by, let's say that if I found, as I'm going to start looking for ground, I mean, always have my eye on what's available, and have had for years,
Sure.
just very, very driven to see what's out there. I have one ranch that I've been looking at up in South Dakota, about 3 hours north of us, that I would just it would be the greatest place to have 100 families on. It's about 3,000 acres, and it has 12 miles of a river running through it, and it's just this beautiful, beautiful ranch out in the middle of South Dakota. But I also think there's a lot of people who would just love to be self-sufficient and have a little, who would pay to have um, a little homestead built for them on 5 acres. And if we
Right.
found some 20-acre parcels and subdivide it, and there's people who come along, then it provides an income for the people who are living on these places, an
Okay.
income for rural folks to make a living building cabins and greenhouses and helping, and people with excavators and so on and so forth and everything else, to have a living in a rural setting, which sometimes can be very difficult. It's difficult to make a living in a rural, especially the way things have gone with farming. If you don't have 1,000 acres and a debt, that's bigger than what you can afford, you can't make a living farming, really.
No, I think you're right, and that's what we're up against, right? And it feels like we're coming fast to a tipping point in certainly in Western civilization, specifically America, where it's
Mm-hmm.
getting harder and harder to own a home, right? I mean, look, I just left Utah, right? And I think the average starter home is going for right about 375 to 400, right? And that's on a postage stamp size lot that doesn't
Mm-hmm.
that still relies on the city services and those sorts of things. So it seems like it's getting farther and farther out of reach, and it's something that I've monitored for quite a while. And um, we're at that point where we got to start coming up with some other ideas, right? And
Yep.
this idea of always looking forward. Don't get me wrong. I'm a guy who loves the latest and greatest shiny thing, right? But sometimes the answers lay in the past, and I think that's kind of where we're at, right? Because again, we've unhinged from reality a little bit. We've unhinged from God. We've unhinged from this idea that we really are dependent upon His blessings and some of those blessings that come from the earth, you know, and we got to get back to that if we want to establish anything real. Um, and we're at that point where we need to start looking for solutions, and quite frankly, kind of a counterculture mentality, right? I'm not saying completely disconnect from society as a whole, because I do believe that we are to be change agents in the society at large, but we don't. It's that old adage: you got to live in the world, but not be of the world, right?
Yeah.
And so it's
Yeah.
it's a fine
I don't know.
balance.
It is a fine balance, and we've kind of played around that, and we use it, I think, as a crutch.
Yep.
Um, because I think that when it comes down to it, if we're looking at the times right now, if it's possible, let's just think for a moment that what we're watching in our lives right now is what our parents and the early brethren and our grandparents waited for. You know,
Hmm.
if we're watching the unwinding of our civilization as prophesied for thousands of years, right? Let's just
Right.
say that this is uh, the beginning or the middle or the portion of that as things take their course. All right.
Right.
I don't think that division. I don't think that the adage in the world but not of the world. Oh, we're in it because we live here, but
Right.
we will be asked to absolutely separate ourselves and at the peril of our lives if we do not,
I
because
I
it's
agree with that.
tear
Yeah.
itself apart. And so, we watch and we're just astounded at the news, the news reels that come in of, the gang violence. And of course, you're brought to if you're a Book of Mormon fan and you love to read that stuff, you just sit and shake your head and going, oh my gosh, you know, it's all, it's all happened. You got the Gadianton robbers at the highest and the lowest levels. And they're all starting to join hands to take over the world.
Right.
And luckily, there is some hope. Isaiah talks about that those, that remnant of a remnant that who are survived. And you think, well, how are they going to survive? Um, well, it's because they will have their own food and they'll be out of a city, and the Lord's protection will then protect them from there if they've done enough to look for the old paths, and if they're willing to do what he asks, they're going to find a place. And it's not going to be easy because we're used to so much being just handed to us, and we're going to have to work our butts off and learn to get along and learn to love one another. And then we're going to have to rely upon the Lord to fight those battles that we can't fight, because we live in a world that there is no place to hide.
Right. Right.
There's no place to hide except within his power.
Yeah, absolutely. You know,
So
and,
that's
and
kind of weirdness.
yeah, well, and here's the thing, right? Take the last days equation out of it, right? How many
Mm-hmm.
people would just love to get out of the city, right? I think if
Yeah.
there's one thing that COVID taught us, it's that the model that we've been living with is highly unsustainable, right? It takes
Mm-hmm.
one black swan event before civilization is brought to its knees, right?
Right.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
we saw what happened when you lived in massive cities during COVID. It was a nightmare. It was horrific, right? The
Yeah.
food chain was all jacked. You couldn't get the stuff you needed. It absolutely exposed us, right? And quite frankly, I feel like it was a gentle nudge from the Lord to be like, look, don't forget,
Yeah. Yeah.
what's going on here. And so
Yeah.
just take the last day's equation out of it. There's a ton of people now that want to get out of those metroplexes. They just want out. They've determined it's not sustainable, even if there's not a crisis, right? And so folks want to get out of that as quickly as they can. So let's work this plan here a little bit, right? So you got some land. We'll just assume you got some land, you're ready to go. I want to talk about the two or three types of people you brought up, and I want to talk about their various roles in this, because I
Mhm.
think that's important to bring out for people who might be interested. So first, let's talk about those people who want to maybe move out there but aren't quite ready yet, right? The people, and kind of the vibe I got. These are the ones that have, access to financial resources. Is that a fair assessment?
I think it's a very fair assessment. There's no reason to pull any punches. We all live at different levels of financial ability,
Right.
you know, to go out and buy something. But yet we also live in a society that I think now they're trying to figure out how to get people into 40 and 50-year mortgages.
Yep.
That's the
Yeah.
new deal. That's the new deal that's going to save the world.
The New
Um,
Deal.
yeah, the new deal that your grandkids will be paying off your house. And what a joke.
Yep.
Um,
So
so
what would those people do? Those that have those financial resources.
I think there's a lot of folks. I've known a lot of people that are, have given the time in their lives to building up businesses and careers and are, doctors and lawyers and dentists and all those kinds of things. But their income and the continuation of it is tied to being in a city where there's people who purchase their services. Just for the most part, it really is.
Hmm.
And so many of them would desire to live outside if they just thought there was a way. And they look for a cabin in the woods, or a cabin at the ski resort, because it gives you that sense of, oh, I got out of the city. And you can drive for a half hour, 45 minutes, or even 2 hours, and you just relax more than you've relaxed in a long time. And you decompress. Why? Because you're out of the damn city.
Hmm.
2 million people all thinking different and weird thoughts, and half of them thinking mean thoughts. And you think that doesn't affect your being? It does. It just works on us. I mean, my first wife and I used to drive down from Montana, and we'd get about to Tremont, and you could feel it.
Hmm.
Maybe we were just being weird, but you could feel the difference. And Tremont's still rural.
Right.
That's out. That's in the middle of nowhere, Utah, right? Not anymore, maybe, but you could feel the tension in the air. But you sure got used to it real easy. By the time I'd hit, Murray, I was looking at the cool cars on the freeway, going, "Oh man, wish I could afford one of those." you
Yeah.
know. And so you just adjust, and then it becomes like any other day. But it's a hard thing to want to disconnect. Sorry, Dave, I lost my train of thought there. I
No, you're
went
good. We were
on.
talking about
Yeah,
that first group and how they fit into this plan.
yeah,
So
no,
are these going to be people that you envision moving in right away? Are they going to be ones that uh, like as you look at it, are these people who are maybe just looking at preparing a place to kind of bug out to when they want to or retire on? I
mm-hmm.
mean, what do you see these folks looking at real seriously?
No, I think that there's a class of people that out there that have the resources. If they knew that they could live in a community where I've been calling it a turnkey homestead,
Hmm.
they could have a place. They could buy 5 or 10 acres and build a place, and while they're building, there could be a little cabin built for them to come visit to. But at the same time, as a part of my idea for some of the subdivisions would be that the idea is to be self-sufficient if you live there, or to seek to be self-sufficient, because
Right.
that helps the whole. At a certain level, somebody buys a piece of property, you can't force them, nor would I want to force them to do anything. But the idea is we want this to be a self-sufficient property, you know and if you can't see yourself working the land in some way, then maybe you could lease it to some of the neighbors who want to do more. you
Okay.
know Maybe you could even
Okay.
give them first rights of, that before you turn it into something else. Consider leasing out this ground for the cows that your neighbor doesn't, if he wants to expand and has a child who wants to raise an extra steer or something.
Right. Right.
So there's all sorts of things that you could do. Once again, I don't believe in, I believe in freedom at a
Sure.
level of private property rights, and I would never want
Sure.
to
Sure. Sure.
things. But the idea is, here's a piece of property for you, and this is the idea that we're working with on this property.
Sure. So these are
Uh,
folks who wouldn't be living there full time right away. These are
Probably not
folks,
right away.
these would be folks who would be in the city at their jobs for a while things are getting set up. And they
Yeah.
would be the one
Yep.
with financial means. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. And there might be other classes of those who might want to move in right away. You know,
Right.
I,
And yeah, yeah, absolutely. It's not going to be 100% across the board, right? But by and large, that's kind of your idea. So
yeah.
now let's talk about that next group of people who you said, don't have resources but are maybe skilled craftsmen of some sort, right?
Sure.
How do they acquire this land then?
Yeah. Well, I think that there could be, our society has used, or at least used to use, the idea of sweat equity
Hmm.
to obtain land, to obtain a portion off of their house. And, one of the things that I learned when I was in Montana was that because I built everything by myself and the land was fairly cheap, that I ended up with no bills. So, how can we help? That would be to, would be try to encourage, this isn't about, these communities aren't about building big mansions.
Right.
If a person wants to buy the land and they're going to build it, I can't, I'm not going to say don't do that at all. I don't, once again, personal tastes, build what you want to build.
Right.
But I think that if they realize the times that we're in, and that, let's say that we took somebody who didn't have the means but was willing to work for, let's say, for example, I'm building a little 10 by 16 tiny home right now, a little log home out here on my property. The intent is to develop um, a clientele and start selling tiny homes. I have a little sawmill and I cut wood and bring it in and make the beams and the lumber to build all sorts of farm type buildings and homes. So let's say that I had somebody who came and said, Jeff, I think this is a great idea. I'd love to be a part of this. What do I got to do? And I say, well, what skills do you have? And we sit down and, would you like to learn how to, how to build greenhouses? Would you like to learn how to build, help me learn and learn woodworking with log cabins, because I happen to have a sawmill, not because log cabins are better than straw bale
Right.
houses. I just happen to have a sawmill. And so I would take that person on as a, and I have a couple of cabins on the place, and this one is going to either sell right away or I'll turn it into a residence on my property for someone like that. And they can come and they can help me, and we'll figure out what that means for wages and in building other cabins and learning how to do other agrarian type ideals that would then give them the knowledge to help other people in the community who then want those services. So, let's say we teach classes for a year and they work with me on building a cabin, and we put aside, pay them some and put aside some to buy their 5 acre parcel. And
Okay.
at
So that's how they would
the
acquire that.
end of a year or whatever, I'm not saying that's where it's at, because I don't have
Sure.
I don't know yet. It will depend on how much we pay for each parcel and what that means and the amount of time. But, a place where a person could come as literally like an internship, where they come and they live and they have a house, and they don't have to pay for where they stay because they're giving their labor
Right.
to be here. And so their room and board would be taken care of. And then at the end of a said period of time, they certainly don't have to stay. You can go off into the world and do what you want, but you might
Right.
also want to take that value and put it towards your 5 acres. So now we figure out how to get you a little tiny house on the property so that you have a place to live that doesn't have a mortgage, and you have a piece of ground where you can raise your own food. And
Right.
then not only that, the neighbor down the road, you sell that lot, and you say, look, we've got Joe over here who is skilled as this, and he does these things, and he knows how to take care of a greenhouse because he learned that while he was working here. And he's been through these classes that we are teaching. I would like to have a school where all of these things are taught.
Sure.
And that person can then be employed by the folks who really want to have a turnkey homestead. And they say, we're not moving in for a couple of years or until things get really bad, but let's build that greenhouse because we love growing our
Right.
own veggies. And let's do one of those Wallapini underground deals that Jeff's done before, and let's figure out how we can. We would like goats for milking, you know, and so we build him a barn, and so he builds him a barn, gets paid for his services there, for his time, and and then he decides, do you want to milk goats every day and night for these people? And
Right.
sell them at the local thing, or make butter with it, or make soaps or whatever, and then they, because they own it, would get a percentage of those things, and they work out a business arrangement, and he takes care of their homestead so that when crap hits the fan and they bug out, they pull up and the greenhouse is growing and the goats are milking, and the next morning he shows up and for a week or two teaches them how to run their homestead,
Yep.
or maybe they decide to keep him on. You
Right.
know, they don't
Right.
want to milk the dang goats. That's okay too if they still have a steady stream of income.
Right. Right. No,
I mean,
that makes sense. So these people would be, not necessarily even skilled labor, right? These are just people who wouldn't mind coming and learning about the what it would take to homestead a piece of property. Is that right?
I think so. I think that, and don't say they wouldn't be skilled, because those are the old skills.
Right, right. Well,
Those are Abraham skills. Thank you very much.
they would be skilled after, right? But
Yes. No,
coming to you, they may or may not already have that.
yeah, you may not, you wouldn't even have to have that, because these are skills that you can learn, and that I think the Lord wished we'd learned as kids.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, to be a husbandman requires a lot different things than being a jet pilot, but you can learn them, and anybody can learn them.
Right.
How to take care of animals and raise a garden, and and there just seems to be that all the things that we were supposed to learn got um get dealt a bad card in our society as to why would anybody want to be a farmer,
Right.
there was a guy, I can't remember his name, so this is terrible, but there was a paper that was written at BYU, I think, as a master's paper, that was called agrarianism and the Mormon people, or the agrarian way of life and the Mormon people.
Okay.
And the guy did a terrific job. He's still a professor, I believe, in Texas, at Austin, Texas, and you could probably find it online. I've found it several times, but it was just a masterful work where he took and showed what happened, a timeline of how in the mainstream church we went from being an agrarian people to
Mm-hmm.
being an urban and then a city people. And
Right.
how the brother tried and tried and tried to stop it. They even started a fund, much like the perpetual immigration fund, to try to get people to go back to the country and farm. And
Right.
they were giving money to these, but they couldn't keep the people from moving to the cities.
Right.
And as much as they talked about it and preached from the pulpit, it was almost a lost cause. The people were like, no, we will not live the old ways.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Okay, was there another type of person there, or was that pretty much it?
I imagine there will be folks, that could probably afford to come and buy a parcel and build something that's ready to move in right away, or that's in the mid range of that. And it's possible that we could take groups of people in the beginning, and put a little tiny house and a little barn and a little greenhouse on, to begin with, on every parcel, just as a way to give work and train and teach, making those parcels more valuable. And then people who come along, I mean, we're not talking, the idea would be to try to be as, to kind of scale down our consumerism and our need for extravagance. Not that we have to live in poverty, we don't, to have nice things, but to keep it simple.
Right.
And I would not want to dictate that, but at the same time, if there's a lot of folks now, this whole tiny house movement is kind of a big deal, because people just can't afford a real house.
Right.
Is that the right word, a real house? I learned that shelter was way different than I thought it was. We lived
Hmm.
in a team to start with, and it was great. Um, it- we're just so spoiled. We're so
Yeah.
spoiled in this society, and it will be the undoing of many of us because
No,
we'll
no,
rebelling.
you're 100% correct. You're 100% correct. I think it's already proving to be that way. Okay, so let me ask you this question, and then I want to move on to some more philosophy of this whole thing, I think. But inevitably, when you gather people together,
Mm-hmm.
you need a way of people have to know how to govern themselves, right? Um, how do you propose that gets taken care of, right? Because you don't want complete anarchy out there, right? You gotta figure out some sort of structure, so to speak, to keep everybody from kind of crapping on their neighbor. How do you do that?
Well, interestingly enough, we have a plethora of laws in the world, and in our society still has the remnants of the laws of civility. If you do bad things, the sheriff can still come out and take care of it.
Right,
The part of the problem is we have too many of those.
right,
They're gotten too picky. So I don't think it's a matter that any where I live in South Dakota, we're in a county that still allows you to build something without all the mess that you would go through, say, in another state or another in a city area.
right.
Even two counties over from me, where Rapid City is, their subdivision laws and everything else are much more strict. But as far as gathering of people together, we still have the structure in South Dakota that is meant to maintain law and order. And if people get along here, we haven't seen a lot of the things that in our little town that you would see elsewhere. I don't know, and I hope that doesn't change. But it's a lot different in the country than it is in the cities.
Yeah,
And as far as behavior is concerned, we still have laws that are kept by a sheriff who's elected, and those are all good things. They're all old remnants of a system that was meant to be. You know,
right.
um,
There's another mechanism when it comes to subdivisions that I think could be helpful for you here, and that's called covenants, conditions, and restrictions, CC&Rs.
good old CC&Rs, yeah.
Now, typically, in most modern day subdivisions, are used for stupid things like you can't
Right,
leave your trash can sitting at the curb for a certain amount of time, or you gotta have your garage door closed. But
right,
I
right.
have seen a few, not exactly what you're talking about, but things that are kind of close, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where it was a definite idea. You weren't just purchasing a piece of ground, you were purchasing almost a way of life, right? And
Right.
so, like, you could do a lot through those CC&Rs,
Mm-hmm.
because they're going to kind of line out how things go, right? Like, you want to talk about the reverse end of CC&Rs, right? Where they could be good, but some of them are bad. If you like go up to Park City or Deer Park or any of those places in Utah that are, just resort hubs, basically,
Mm-hmm.
there's some that say you can't live there year round, right? Like this only can be a vacation home, but your vacation home has to be well in excess of $1 million, right?
Right.
Um, you could do something kind of similar in the opposite direction to get the results that you want, so to speak, or that you desire to attract the kind of people you want.
Right.
So that's something that can be looked at there.
I
Um,
think I think that if I think this is probably going to most likely go in a direction where there will be groups of individuals who would, and this is naturally probably appropriate, group, either family groups, church groups, who are going to want to do something with people they already know. And I think that's great, because the more you know and the more you're willing to get along, the more chance you have of creating a cohesive community. And so under those circumstances, I mean, I think I'm going to start I want to build something for my children and something for my children's children, and people that I know and individuals that come along. And I would also like to very much help the remnant. So this is a lot of this is an outgrowth of my idea, but I can't also force that upon other people as well. If I
Right.
with a 200-acre parcel and I want to, make 45-acre lots, and I decide to put half of those into individuals who are willing to work and learn and help the other, and they end up with a parcel that's paid off and a home that they can live in, and they have no bills like I did in Montana, and so on and so forth. And we put in solar and other types of things, plus wood stoves and other types of things, so that they're more self-sufficient, even no matter what happens to the grid. Now they don't have to make 4,000 a month to live. They
Right.
might get on $500 a month, especially if they're raising their own food.
Right.
Now they're free. Now the community's free to what? Guess what? Help each other if somebody has a problem, or if their barn burns down, or I got to go to work. No, you go help your neighbor. But my thoughts are, where CCNRs and things like that are concerned, I think that the groups and the people, I mean, you could start, if nobody, I could start to try to build one and say, here's what I'm thinking. But what if another family group came along and said, hey, I got probably 15 potential families looking for a place. What can you find us and help us get into? um, I think it'd be great to say, what do you guys want to build? how do you
Right.
how do you what kind of CCNRs do you want? I don't care. You make it. See what works. Sit down with your family and with your family group and pray about it and ask the Lord what's appropriate. You guys
Right.
find out. I really think He wants us to figure things out, this
I do
stuff out
too.
for ourselves by doing it. And we're a day late and a dollar short, but we still have a hope, I think.
Right. Well, I do look, and I think you're right. Because look, sometimes we speak of Mormonism and we feel like it's a monolith, and it's really not. Right. As I've dove into all sorts of Mormon expressions, if you will,
Mm-hmm.
they're all a little bit different, right? And what works for one group might not work for another. And so it's
Yep.
going to have to be one of those things, like you were just saying, it's going to have to be tailor made to the person starting it. Um, but yeah, there's got to be some structure in place to kind of keep things from blowing up, right? A way to resolve issues and those sorts of things. Um, and maybe that's just me because I'm jaded from years of, watching people fight over a foot strip of ground and,
Yeah.
everything else. I've just seen it too often to see human nature begin to to cause things to deteriorate a little bit if there's not some sort of governor that's not like governor in terms of like a state governor,
Sure.
but
Right.
something to kind of allow that steam to get blown off and problems to be resolved.
Ultimately, when you think about, the structures that we have in the church and in history, the most basic, that's why I kind of bring up family groups. You know, family groups get along oftentimes because there's a natural governance.
Right,
You've got the grandpa, and then you
right.
got his sons who are old enough to treat grandpa good, you know, and they basically, if they're going to want to do something together, they can put something together, and there is a governance because they're family. They live together and they've figured out, what mom and dad say and how they feel and how we're going to make it. I guess you'd call it a patriarchal
Sure,
situation.
sure.
And of course, the church has varying groups of patriarchal situations, throughout their history, and you gather
Right.
together these and this and that and the other. But so, a ward family in the church could figure something like this out. They, it's difficult because they're taught that they can't do this, anything like this. It has to come from the head, and it hasn't yet come down. My prayer is that it would. But in the meantime, I think we need to be anxiously engaged in a good cause because our country's fallen apart.
Yeah, no, I agree. And you hit on something else that I think super important. And I want to be sensitive here. I do know that there are extenuating circumstances that require this, but I don't think it's as much as what we've gotten used to as of late. But it wasn't that long ago that we didn't ship our elderly off to a nursing home, right?
Mm-hmm.
When mom and
Yep.
dad got too old, they either came to live with the kids or they lived close enough that the kids could run up and check on them. And
Yep.
likewise, I think that, gosh, and this is the part of the conversation I'm most excited about having. Back to this idea of being detached from civilization, or
Mm-hmm.
not civilization, but detached from what has served humanity well, and quite frankly, divinely inspired things, right? In the old days, you know, grandma and grandpa were close, right? So the kids would go over and they would hear about how grandma and grandpa survived. And
Mm-hmm.
that's how those ideas were passed down. I mean, let's just be honest. How many women do we know of today that can still can? I mean, as just a general rule. Um, I think you'd be pushing it to say 10% of the population, right? That would know how to harvest, a garden and then can it and keep it for the leaner times. Um,
Right.
how many guys know how to go get game? How many guys know how to raise an animal? I
Mm-hmm.
think you're down to about 10% of modern day population, at least within the states, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's funny. I look around and I think, and this is why I don't go to parties a whole bunch because I'm no fun, but I start looking I start
Yeah.
I start looking at this, and it's one of those things where we've detached from reality. Our society kind of wants you to. That it's geared towards that. Um, and I just don't, we don't go. I mean, not only do we not go, farmers markets now are kind of a trendy thing, right? That was called the market in the old days, right? Um, and now that's a trendy thing to do because it's, whatever, trendy, I guess. But we've got to get back to that, right? We got to get back to being local, and we have to get back to being real. And until we do that, I think we just continue to feed the beast, so to speak, right? We just keep playing into the system, and that has definite ramifications. I look at kids today, right? And that's spooky to me, to be right honest with you. The amount
Mm-hmm.
of anxiety that kids have now is just not natural. I mean, when you and I had a bad day at school, we went home and we forgot about it for a day or so. It's
Yeah.
no longer the same way, right? I mean, now with technology, the bullying that a kid might receive at school, that's kind of following you home now on your phone. And that's leading to some things that, quite frankly, I don't think mankind was ever equipped or should be equipped to deal with. I think we're doing a lot of unnatural things, and it's beginning to really come back to bite us. And we're just now starting to see that.
Earlier we were talking about a little bit about Isaiah and how he said, "Come out of her, oh, ye my people, that you be not partakers of her plagues."
Mm-hmm.
Things that you're talking about are the plagues that are
Yep.
manifest. We all love, from the time you're young, if you lived in the country, you wanted to get out and go to the city and experience the fast life. That's
Yep.
what kids wanted. They wanted away from the farm.
Right.
And but the reality is all of these things, I was taught from the time I was a little kid that the adversary wants to destroy, if there is a devil, and I believe there is, that it's his, for whatever reason, he's angry, he's mad, he's demented, whatever, he wants to destroy the plan that this earth was presented as such, which is families. The best, the Lord knows, the best way to raise up a human being and to teach them the things they need to survive, we'll call it salvation, if you will, are learned best in a family where we could go on and on about this forever. But all these things that we're watching in our society are designed typically to destroy
Yep.
families. If you sit back and look at them, you cannot but admit that that's not good. And
Right.
why was that? Can there be goodness in it? Well, yeah, there might be goodness in it at a certain percentage, but it's toxic, it's addictive, and it will eventually kill your children or
Yeah.
or me, you know. And so I really think that the Lord in his soft little, he loves to throw out little one-liners in the scriptures, like, get married and multiply and replenish. And we have no clue that that is the essence of this experience, is to perpetuate the plan of God by having children and teaching them, and we learn in the process how to be wise stewards over children and ourselves, and we don't really learn anything till we're an adult and a parent anyway. So it's really just this master plan of heartache and sorrow laced with joy and wonder, and yet the adversary knows that he can strip that away by creating a society that models and yet undermines that plan. It takes care of us and makes us feel comfortable and leads us into all these things that are supposedly happy, and at the same time there is no long lasting joy in them, because they're destructive, and they're an abomination, because they're the counterfeit of the truth, which is running to grandma's house, which is two doors down, and sitting on her lap when you're a little kid, because she's still there.
Right. Right.
And asking her what she did when she was a kid. She says, "Oh, we used to go out and pluck the goats when nobody was looking, or pluck the chickens, and make them run around, or whatever." You get these stories from your
Right.
ancestors, and it's just, that's where the joy and the happiness of the whole system is. And so then the Lord along the way says things like, well, look for those old paths, and you'll find the good way. Like,
Absolutely.
leave me alone. I'm going to move to the city and get a real job where
Yeah.
I can't even follow the spirit if it talked to me. What would most people do if a voice from heaven came to them in the morning prayer and said, I need you to go talk to your neighbor at noon?
More than likely, you would probably go seek your doctor and get a prescription for that. Um,
Yes. And even if you believed it, could you take off work? Would you take
right.
off for a voice in your head?
Right. No,
No.
no,
So, I know that's weird, but I enjoy weird. I
no,
live
I don't think it's weird.
long enough to enjoy, the word weird. Original meaning of the word weird was almost along with the meaning of the word amazing. It was a description of the ways of God. And
Yeah,
so I
peculiar.
embrace, yeah, I embrace it as something that I've experienced, and it is weird, and I like it.
Yeah.
You know,
Well,
you can call
yeah,
me weird.
we're just doing things that aren't natural, right? I mean, look, the amount of time, boy, am I getting in so much trouble. The amount of time a kid spends in school now,
Mm-hmm.
that's not natural. That's
No,
just
no,
not
it's
natural,
not.
right? If you look at a normal school day back when we were first starting things, it was 4 hours long, right? Tops.
Yeah, yeah,
And sometimes it wasn't even every day, right?
right,
But you went back home to your parents where your parents raised you. You went to school to get just an education.
right.
The teacher wasn't there instilling morals and values for the most part. They assumed you got that before you ever came to school. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but and likewise for adults, I mean, we're crammed into cubicles now, right? And that's not healthy. I don't care what anyone says. I mean, there was a
Yeah.
there was a very interesting stat when COVID was happening, that an overwhelming majority of people that were hospitalized, not all, I want to, again, this is a generalization, but the vast majority of people who ended up in the hospital with COVID were vitamin D deficient, right? Well, where's the biggest source of vitamin D we get? It's from the sun, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so that tells you that, hey, we're doing some things that aren't conducive to the human experience. And
Mm-hmm.
um, people are now just a cog in the wheel of wherever they're at, and that tends to be detrimental to our physical health, our emotional health, our spiritual health. I mean, the last few years have been weird because I've rethought everything that I thought was normal, right? And what I'm discovering is that normal isn't so normal it's not normal in the grand scheme of things, in the vast breadth of human existence. What we're doing now is relatively new, and we haven't yet began to understand the the ramifications of that, right? We see it, we know that something's wrong, right? Why is there mass, epidemics of not being healthy, right? I mean, things like, I read a study here the other day. I should say I listened to it. I was listening to a book on tape when I was at the gym, on Audible, that talked about, like, the average American male now has half the testosterone his grandfather had, right? What is happening? And until I think we start asking some really strong questions, we're not going to get the right answer. I don't think the answer is going and taking a needle every whatever it is to get your testosterone back up. I think the answer is probably like, okay, well, let's look at and see how we're living, and then make a determination from there, and
Mm-hmm.
start prescribing some of these old things, which is what I found so fascinating about your plan. But
Yeah.
anyway,
Did you ever read any of any of the works of Weston Price? Are you
no,
familiar with him?
nope,
He was a doctor, a dentist in the, I think he was born in the 1860s and practiced through the, became a dentist in Ohio, I believe. And he recognized, through his practice, he was taken by his observation that people with cavities also seem to have a high incidence of degenerative disease.
okay,
And so it really drove him to find out why. And he quit his practice early, and he and his wife bought one of the first cameras and went around the world looking for groups of people who did not have cavities
okay,
to see whether they also did not have degenerative disease.
okay,
And he started this in about, I think he went from 1829 to 39. Anyway, he was out there for like 10 years. And his study, when he was finished, with pictures, cameras had just kind of come into their own. He was taking pictures, and he found like 14 different cultures who had no cavities throughout their life as a culture.
hmm.
And they also never brushed their teeth.
Ugh. Ugh.
They were all indigenous
Ugh.
people. Well, they were all indigenous peoples, and um, who lived outside of the influence of Western food and
Okay,
medicine. So this was in the in the 1920s, 29, 20 through 29 or something. And some of those cultures were the Eskimos. Some of them were the Indian. There was an Indian tribe. There was culture in Africa, and he found out, that, and Swedish. If you went far enough back into the Alps where the roads quit, then he found indigenous Swedes who were not eating white sugar, white flour, processed foods, canned foods. Okay.
okay,
And noticed that these folks had many things in common. And I can't remember all of them, but they all had like five or six different things in common in their diets, though their diets were vastly different.
okay,
They all shared animal fats as a source of natural fats in their diet. Um, they all had, meats, of course, of some sort. They all relied on, primarily probably because to keep their foods from spoiling, such as sauerkraut. They all had some form of fermented foods
okay,
in their diet. So they probably didn't realize it, but they were getting all their gut flora recharged
right,
in the wintertime as they ate the stuff that they were preserving.
right.
they didn't have to know it. It was simple. It's how they provided their food without refrigeration to
Right.
last. Anyway, so it goes on, and so he created a foundation which is flourishing today, even, and a lot of the science that he developed is now coming into the forefront through different diets that are proving themselves. But it's called the Weston A. Price Foundation. But the reality is they were just living off the land simply in
Right.
whatever form they found it where they lived, in whatever place on the earth they lived. Even the Eskimos fell into that category.
Right.
And but these people had full sets of teeth that they never lost, and their jaw structure was even more fuller, so none of their teeth were crowded, nor did they need, did it appear as if their teeth were crowded or misshapen or out of place. And he found that if he went into the Alps and he dealt with some of these people, and he studied their children who had moved to town 20 years earlier to get married and have children and work in town, and their children had smaller jaws and crowded teeth.
Huh.
And he took the families back, or followed a family back, and studied what happened with a year or two later when they had new children. Their jaws were fully formed with perfect teeth because they were
Mm.
back on the farm eating the proper foods. And so that was what, three generations from, that was 100 years ago. So we were almost four generations of people. And the reality of living a diet that is opposite to what God provided, and what it's done to humanity itself, in our health, our well-being, our mental status, our diseases, our ability to think properly, our ability to behave, the presence of certain abnormalities that we experience that create social disorders and interesting things in our life, are rampant. And could you trace it back to the fact that we moved to the city?
Right. No, I think
I'm
I think
just
you
saying.
I think you
Just saying.
absolutely I think you absolutely can. And look, I think we're foolish if we think this stuff didn't creep into Mormonism, right? You
We
know
embraced it.
you know who Joshua Erickson is?
Absolutely. Good friend.
So Josh has been on my podcast several times. I want to say 5 or 6 times.
Mm-hmm.
And he did an episode with me that talked about the word of wisdom, right? And what was originally put down in the word of wisdom, punctuation wise, versus what was
Yeah.
changed. Wait for it. Heber J.
Yeah, a
Grant.
little comma.
Yeah. Yeah. A little comma. And all of a sudden that changes everything, right?
Who put
And
that in there?
that would be Heber J. Grant,
No, but that's what Joseph F. Smith said when he saw it. Who put that in there?
right?
Because he had no idea. It got snuck in without his approval. Who
Right.
put
Right.
who put? But he
But it was
recognized the comma.
Yep. But it was all because that changes how that reads dramatically, right? So you
Totally changes it. Totally.
because you go back, you were talking about animal fats, right?
Right. Right.
There is some interesting history now that's been done on um sclerosis of the arteries, right? Clogged arteries. And
Mm-hmm.
forever we've been told, well, that's due to animal fats, right?
Right.
The first study that was produced actually came up with no, it was processed sugar and flours that were doing it, right? And what you find is that once you get rid of the processed sugars, the processed flours, um, all of a sudden, a lot of that stuff goes away, right?
Yep.
And
Yep.
it's creeped into Mormonism, and to the point that, look, I'll be honest, there's even certain fundamentalists that I've met that have went all vegan or vegetarian because they
Mhm.
think that's what the word of wisdom says, right?
Right.
And
Yep.
so it's one of those things, right, where you have to question to a degree kind of everything you've been taught up to this point, right? And then be willing to take a good hard look at things and say, okay, where's things really lie? And are we really doing things to the way that the Lord prescribed, or did man get in there and fumble with those as well? Um,
Mhm.
I know that as you were alluding to, this idea of we'll just move into the city. The church largely embraced a lot of that as well, right? Like,
Well, they created a city. They didn't, in the beginning, that wasn't their intent, although they knew there would be a big city there,
right,
you know, but it just grew up around them. And as the people started to move to Salt Lake, the brethren tried to stop them.
right. Yep.
They had, when that's what I'm saying, that little paper that got put out was so, and when it really happened, 1890.
Huh.
Some of
Interesting.
Yeah, some of the talks that were coming out, I mean, it wasn't all at once.
Sure.
But that's when the tide started to change and they started just begging the people stay on the farm. There's this one letter that a kid wrote in, and he wrote to the juvenile instructor, which was like the ensign of the time, or the era, the youth magazine. And I think the 12, or whoever, were probably editors of such. But he wrote a letter saying, I'm tired of living on the farm. Me and my dad don't get along. And this was like 1889. And he wrote this letter to the church office building saying, I just want to come get an education, and I want to be an accountant, and I want to move to the city where I can have a nice job and not work so much. And they wrote him back publicly and said, you're a fool.
Wow.
There's green grass and rain, and God gives rain from the city. You will have food. Find yourself a beautiful farm girl, settle down, put your nose to the plow, and don't look back.
Yeah.
Urged
Yeah.
him not to get a degree, not to come to the city. You stay out there and raise some food.
Well, and
Holy mackerel, we've come a long way.
well, and here's the thing too, right? I mean, education, that's another one, right? Think about the insanity of this, right? And I fell into this trap.
Yeah,
And a couple of my kids did as well,
yeah,
where you were like, now go to college, take out hundreds, sometimes hundreds of thousands of dollars worth
right.
of student loans
Yeah,
to go get a degree in something that may or may not recoup that money throughout your life.
right,
And it's the only debt in the United States that you can't escape, right? Like if something happened tomorrow and you just graduated college, you're in a horrible accident, you can't do the job that you went to school for, you're still on the hook for those loans. Bankruptcy will not wipe that clean. Now, here's my other thought. If a kid is too young to drink at age 18, shouldn't the same philosophy about maybe not taking out hundreds of thousands of dollars of loans also apply there, right? I mean, if you're saying they're too young to make the decision to have a beer, I also think then if that's the case, they're probably too young to make a decision that will that will cause them to go hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt. Now, I'm
right,
not espousing that we coddle kids until they're 18 years old, but what I am saying is that you can't have it both ways, right? You can't have that level of control over a young person and say, no, you can't do that. And then at the same time say, but you should totally take out loans in the excess of $100,000 for an education. I mean, look, at age 18, well, I'm probably a different example because I grew up really fast after my dad died, but you take the normal 18-year-old and they are not equipped to make those decisions right now, Jeff. We just have raised children to the point that they're still children into their early 20s, and that's a problem. And so this really what we find ourselves in now has been a problem that's been 100 years in the making that quite frankly I feel like was probably designed from the beginning.
that's kind of what you almost can't escape as you ponder all of these things in their entirety, and why and how come. And one of the scriptures, I don't know where it's at, talks about an enemy hath done this.
Right.
And if we believe the possibility that there is an evil designing being who really is so mad that he wants to destroy Heavenly Father's plan, his world, his children, everything. literally. Then you begin to look at these things differently and you go, oh my gosh,
Right.
look at that. That's what's going on here. It's the prophesied destruction of the children of God if they don't keep the simple path that God's asked them to live from the beginning.
Right.
And he just comes in and he takes an idea that's good and wholesome, like food and helping people, and he turns it into a diet that destroys them
Yep.
out of convenience. He
Yep.
takes an idea like education, and it goes from education to indoctrination,
Right.
but it still wears the trappings of education. So how dare you speak against education? All children need to be educated. That's a good godly pursuit. And even
Right.
with our community, education's up here. Well, it should be education, but what kind of education? See, we've missed the whole boat. We do the same thing with religion. He just twists it and turns it and turns it and waters it down, or does this or takes away until it doesn't even resemble what God wanted. He's done the same thing with family. He's done the
Yep.
same, take every single thing out there and see where there's been a concerted effort to change its definition, its meaning, so that we perceive it differently and miss the boat. And we live it wrong. And yet we tell ourselves that it's everything we're supposed to be doing.
Well, yeah, and the messaging is part of the problem, right? I mean, look, I remember when I first joined the LDS Church, Gordon B. Hinckley was one of the big prophets about counseling the young men, go to college, get an education, right? Um,
Yeah.
and that doesn't work for everybody, and to be right honest with you, I don't think most of the jobs that we need to do really take that level of education, right? Now, if you're a doctor, if you're a lawyer, if you're a brain surgeon, yeah, I want you in school for a good solid decade, right? To know that you can get inside my head and root around and find the bad switch and get it taken care of. But if you're if you're a draftsman, if you're a surveyor, if you're even a civil engineer for the most part, right? Some education is required, but not to the level that we've done now, right? Why do you have to sit through a philosophy class to learn how to build a bridge? It makes no sense to me, other than it's just a way to strap kids into again more debt so you can make more money. But these things have infiltrated society now, and I don't care if you're Mormon or not, to the point that it's expected, and that's an issue. This idea of education, right? We think that in order to obtain an education, you have to go to college, right? It's not so. You should be seeking after education through your whole life, right? And that's by reading things that aren't just for pleasure or even just religion, right? I want to say that, right? Mormonism is unique. It says all truth belongs to Mormonism.
Yeah.
So you better get out there and read some other things and learn how to do some stuff and understand. But yeah, there has to be a going back to the original definition of things to
Oh.
get back to that.
Well, you think about the simple term, the difference between the terms the gospel and the church,
Yep.
and how that concept has changed.
Yep.
From the gospel of Christ is delivered to the people. The gospel is the importance, it's the truth, it's the good news
Hmm.
of the salvation that is provided through Jesus Christ. The church is a vehicle to deliver that, a necessary thing. But as all things, just like a government that is supposed to be by the people and then ends up not being by the people and for the people, it gets changed. And all of a sudden, we revere the church as the head and the
Hmm.
gospel as something different. And I remember when that first dawned upon me, just the change of that word, the meaning of those two words, and how they were transposed, one being more, the principle that was paramount, now being captured by the vehicle that was to deliver it to the people. And I remember when I started looking at it differently, just like we're talking about education as what does that mean? Does it mean the public school system in our American, universities? No, they educate you, but is that what education is? No, it's not. Education is can be something totally different, and I honor and look forward to all the education that is right that I can gain, and same for my children. So it's just interesting what an enemy hath done amongst us through subtlety and words,
Right.
ideas, and we, as the Lord says, we love to have it so,
Yeah.
because all these things generally lead us down a path that appear to be easier. We're
Right.
beings who don't like work. We're beings who will take the course of the least resistance to our death.
Yeah. No,
So,
I agree with you totally. All right, man. Well, anything else you want to hit on?
I imagine we can do it again sometime. I
Absolutely.
am, I'm glad that we got a chance to chat about it. It's certainly not all fleshed out, but if you have viewers out there who are interested to reach out to you or whatever, feel free to give them my number. I'd be happy to talk with individuals that are interested in exploring ideas, in finding land for their own selves, for their families, and people who are interested in other areas. Start looking, just start asking the Lord what you can do to get out of the cities. I'll say that. I wouldn't want to be caught in the bigger cities, including Salt Lake, or any of those surrounding areas. In the who knows what's going to happen even this year. But when they devolve, it's just not going to be a place to be.
Right. Absolutely.
Um, find a
Um,
place and raise food. Find a place where you can
Perfect.
be at peace.
Perfect. You got
Yeah.
an email address you'd want people to email you if they're
Yeah.
interested?
Yep. They can email me at oldpathsnew@gmail.
Perfect. Awesome. Well, dude,
Yep.
it's fun. Let's do it again. As this plan
Yeah.
gets more and more fleshed out, let's jump back on here and talk more about it.
We'll do it. I appreciate you, Dave.
Appreciate you too. Bye,
All
everybody.
right. We'll see you.